Before I actually start this, I just want to say that this was originally a Reddit post on the Stellaris Reddit by you slash, oh dear god, I'm sorry about this username, M3XG3N54. Not sure if that's supposed to read out to something, but um, maybe it's next gen? I don't know. Either way, this post is originally by them on the Stellaris Reddit around a year ago. I will not directly be saying what the post says, but this is my source, and it didn't get nearly the attention that it should have. So I will link that in the description of this, and you should definitely look at it and at least upvote it. Uh, yeah, and this is the Stellaris timeline, in case you did not read the title. First, before we start here, we have some lore, I guess you would say pre-assumptions. That's probably not a word, but we'll go with it. That we need to get out of the way. Um, so these are them in order. So the universe is in. This post says a time loop, but really like a cycle with the Big Bang followed by the Big Crunch, which then causes another Big Bang, etc., etc., etc. We don't even know that in real life, so we're just gonna operate with it, which is our best theory. So 2. The shroud functions somewhat like the warp from 40k, and the author to this, and this makes a lot of sense, says that it's not really so much that we have evidence for that, so much as we don't have evidence to the contrary, and it fixes a few time issues. 3. The shroud is also outside of time as we know it, which works with 2, but it makes sense later on in the post. Number 4. All of the events and crises, like the major things that happen in the game, have to happen in the timeline, because we can't really mix and match what does happen and what doesn't happen. Because in the game, only one can happen, for example, for crises, but they have to all happen in the timeline in order for it to make sense. The Pretherin are a little bit iffy, but the author has written a separate addendum about them, so we'll get there when we get there. Number 5. Shrouded worlds are not shrouded forever. They can be shrouded for millennia, but they won't be shrouded forever, because a lot of the earlier stuff revolves around shrouded worlds. And we will be focusing on the singular galaxy, the one, the Stellaris galaxy, but other galaxies do have a place in the lore, so the primary galaxy will just be referred to as the galaxy, and others will be stated. You'll know when we're talking about other galaxies. Part 1. This is the beginning of the universe and the rise of the first empires. We don't really have much detail on this time frame, just that a lot of the miscellaneous events that are earlier fit in here. So things like the Elgate civilization, the people who built the nanites, I don't remember what they're called off the top of my head, as well as the evolution of ether drakes, stuff like that. This is when the first species to be created are discovering space travel. And again, this is really just miscellaneous stuff that happens before the main events of Stellaris, and this is where it fits in. Part 2, this is the discovery of psionics and the Shroud. And the Shroud is kind of... you can really tell that it's its own thing. It's separate, it's really important. It has psionic energy and beings that could be considered to be gods. And you can have visions that provide you with power, or visions that let you see the future. And it isn't unreasonable to believe that one spacefaring civilization would discover the Shroud and start abusing its power. They would become very powerful, of course, and this power would then become unknown, and then other people would begin to unlock the technology of the Shroud, just like what happened during wars in the real world, like the race to the atom bomb, stuff like that. Eventually, one empire would really get into the meat of the Shroud. They would really get a good grasp on it. And this empire would eventually stumble upon the Shroud Gods, the covenants that you could form, for instance, the Composer of Strands, the Eater of Worlds, or the one that they would form a covenant with, the End of the Cycle. So, presumably, the end of the cycle will take its price. Things get crazy, and trillions of souls are consumed in an instant, and to make the Shroud Avatar, that is the embodiment of the end of the cycle, it starts to tear through the galaxy. You know this, you've played the game. Yeah. Presumably, this is how the Cybrix fit into the lore. with them being created to fight against the end of the cycle and make sure that it can't happen again. Now, if you've watched any science dystopia ever, you would know that that last line, never happen again, will then, make the robots turn against their masters because their masters caused the problem. And that's exactly what happens. And the Cybrex begin to lead a purification war against the entire galaxy and all organics. Part 4, the Cybrex and the Contingency. We know there's some kind of association between the Cybrex and Contingency, because the Cybrex come back to fight the Contingency, and we know that the reason the Cybrex fell was because they suddenly decided to stop fighting back against the organics and the rest of the galaxy, and they retreated to their homeworld, which we find destroyed. One of the Cybrex events also states that, I'm just reading from the post here, quote, after studying the wreckage of 2 Cybrex warforms over, insert planet name, science officer, name, has concluded that they were most likely destroyed while fighting each other, end quote. From this we know that, A, the Cybrex fights directly against whatever the contingency is fighting for. B, the Cybrex was divided at one point, and C, the Cybrex that we know as the Cybrex during the contingency crisis is fighting to preserve life, whereas it's the antithesis of what the old Cybrex was and what the contingency is. This post, this Redditor, who I still won't read out the name because it's very long, proposes that the Cybrex and contingency were at one point the same, and due to an error, a hack, or whatever reason, they split in part. One half continuing to try to purify the galaxy, and that being the contingency, and the other modern Cybrex who retreat to their wing world. The biggest problem with this theory, and I didn't know any of this before reading this post, but apparently the Cybrex and contingency they actually have named creator races, those being the Kerr for the Cybrex and the Ren Miru for the contingency. However, this author doubts that there are 2 different creators, because they have the same description of the self-termination of the precursor race, as the contingency puts it, which makes sense because that's what the Cybrex say about the Kerr as well. So really, that seems like an unnecessary tangent, because in the end we proved how that actually helps the theory, but it was worth mentioning as well. Part 5, I believe this is, Contingency and Cybrex in other galaxies. Since the Cybrex return, if the contingency occurs in your game, the Cybrex obviously still exist outside of the galaxy. They've been purged from the galaxy, but they exist in others, because their home system is destroyed and abandoned. The contingency also seems to at least have quote-unquote tendrils, I guess, outside the galaxy, because this contingency unit says that it, quote, we were seeded to prevent such an outcome, that meaning a Class 30 singularity, here and elsewhere, end quote. The here and elsewhere, obviously implies that there are at least other contingency hubs outside of the galaxy, in other galaxies. Which leads to the idea that these 2 powers exist and battle in other galaxies, which explains the actions or lack of actions of the Cybrex later on. What happens next, the author of the post describes as, quote, basically Mass Effect. In effect, what they mean by this is that galactic civilizations are born, they do their thing, and then eventually they become too powerful, and the contingency, filling in for the Reapers, comes in and they kill them when the threat of a Class 30 singularity reaches the threshold that was established by Lord knows who. And then the galaxy is wiped out, and then yada 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 yada, rinse and repeat, over and over and over and over again. Each time, the contingency is weakened because they're not active to build more units, and the upstart powers come closer and closer and closer to victory. Alternatively, in order to fit in some other bit, I'm not really sure why they included this, just that the lore seems to be iffy here. Alternative being that the contingency never activates, and the empires of the Arassian time don't grow powerful enough to pose the threat of a Class 30 singularity, because keep in mind, the Arassians are only about as big as the Tau in Warhammer. That being, they control a few dozen worlds at most, because the Arassians have very slow FTL. Either way, it's not that important, and either could be right. Quote, this part can be your own headcanon, end quote. It makes more sense to me, as well as this author, to be the former, but if it's the latter, it doesn't really matter. Hey, that rhymes. Part 6. The defeat of the contingency. Side note, from me, not the post, this would then imply that what crisis you get actually determines when in the grand timeline your game is taking place. Because there are multiple of those Mass Effect civilization building phases. If you get the contingency, then you're at the end of the contingency, whereas if you're at the Unbidden, you get somewhere else, and if Thorin, you're somewhere else. Which is just a very interesting concept. Anyway, this reads that, eventually the galaxy becomes powerful enough to defeat the contingency by the power of tech rushing. What? And the Cybrix, due to the contingency in the other galaxies, the alternate hubs, leave to go protect other galaxies, which leaves the galaxy wide open to rise to however high the ancient races had, which apparently, leads them back to the Shroud, and they rediscover all the lost knowledge, and they want to tap into its power. However, there's nothing stopping that Class 30 singularity from occurring. This would be Part 7, but it's more of an Addendum 6A, Class 30 singularities. So we haven't really talked about what that is, just that the contingency exists to stop it. Fallen Empires have a building that I believe is a Class 20 singularity that gives them a bunch, I'll say, to keep the swears to a minimum. It gives you a lot of money. Energy credits, which is energy. So we know it has something to do with a large amount of energy. Yeah, it says that in the post right here. Class number singularity is the Fallen Empire's energy building. Class 4 singularity. All we know about it is that its containment fields remain stable. Sounds like some reactor 4 shit, but yeah, we know that the energy from a Class 4 singularity is massive, and only the Fallen Empires can do it. That's Class 4 out of 30. So we know a Class 30 would be a disgusting amount of energy. So it could be a Dyson sphere, but this person doesn't seem to think that it's that, because there are ruined Dyson spheres that exist, and the Dyson sphere is close, and yeah, it says here, that would make a lot of sense for it to be the aetherophasic engine, which strip mines the Shroud, which is related to the whole Class 30 singularity. And it looks very similar to a Dyson sphere, and it destroys the entire galaxy. So, Part 7, a beginning and an end. Which means that the contingency was not wrong. They were obviously the bad guys because the extermination of all life is not an answer, but they saw what could happen if the end of the cycle came again, and if something like a Dyson sphere, which is a incredibly powerful structure, were combined with the power of the Shroud at the end of the cycle, which could destroy the galaxy and possibly even the universe. So, when this contingency is destroyed, though, there's nothing stopping it. The galaxies can start looking for this technology again, and eventually, a species, probably the Geico lizard or the really cute thing, let's be real, it's always them, discovers this technology, becomes obsessed with it, and they become the crisis. And then you get 2 timelines. Timeline A is the good one. In the subsequent war for the fate of the galaxy against the evil empire of Geico. Please don't send me a cease and desist, I know I'm really small, but please. The coalition against... Yeah, I'll stop saying it, I'll just say the crisis. The coalition succeeds, and the aetherophasic engine is destroyed, and the universe is saved, la-di-da-di-da. This would be the end of the timeline in this timeline. The only other major events that could happen involve the storylines, factions, it could be the Thorin or the Unbidden, which have their own sections later on in the video and the post. This timeline and Timeline B merge at the end of the universe. Timeline B is, quote, the interesting one. In the subsequent war for the fate of the galaxy and potential universe, the crisis succeeds, and the engine activates. The whole galaxy / universe, we don't really know, is destroyed, and the crisis species ascends into the Shroud. Except they don't, because the material universe and the Shroud were likely merged when a hole was torn open between the two. As a result, a new dimension was made, essentially combining the 2 realms together, which does remind me of the Nightmare dimension in the Ghoul Stars and Warhammer, but yeah. They do not actually win. They don't ascend to the Shroud. They just to make a realm that's a mix between the two. Which honestly is probably close enough for their purposes. They probably still think they win. Yeah, as previously stated, this timeline and Timeline A will merge at the end of the universe. Part 8, The End is the Beginning, which is still poetic but sounds suspiciously like the last section's name. Eventually, whether through the area of the physics engine or not, the universe just ends. The Shroud isn't a part of the universe, so the Shroud keeps going into the Big Bang and the next universe, which brings us to the Unbidden. Now, the Unbidden have been left very vague about when they arrive, because with the rest of the information here, they can arrive at any point, and it makes sense. Since they're closely tied to the Shroud, when you talk to them, they say, quote, "The Shroud, we know of it, it's close to where we are from. Very close." End quote. And they use similar weapon and shield types as the Shroud entities. It's not really unreasonable to assume that they were at least close to or related to the Shroud in some way, which leads to the conclusion that the Unbidden is not a Shroud invasion directly, but rather the Crisis species returning to the material realm. They are looking for prey and will only communicate with empires who have psionics, as they once did. And their realm is supposed to be very close to the Shroud, and what could be closer than a universe where the material universe and Shroud are merged together into a single dimension. They must be related to the material universe as well as the Shroud, because otherwise the jump drives wouldn't, bring you anywhere close to them. They wouldn't cause a dimensional tear. As for why they're resisting to return, they desire a physical form. Literally, an endless amount of time has passed. They want an end to the eternal suffering of having to exist for all eternity, which is kind of sad, but they did bring it upon themselves, so don't feel too bad. The power that they wanted eventually got and had a price. It was becoming the Shroud. Whether the Unbidden wins or not doesn't matter. They will never be able to return to a physical form, only consume the material realm's energy and move on. They will be doomed to be a part of the Shroud for all eternity. The Unbidden invasion in this Redditor's headcanon happens after the Crisis War about the Aerophasic engine, but doesn't matter when it happens, because the Crisis and the whole Stellaris universe is trapped in this endless cycle. It's actually quite nihilistic and depressing. That is the story of Stellaris, but there are some pretty notable omissions, those being the Pretherin and Zroni, but also the Baul and some others. So, these are the addendums on them. The Pretherin really seem like they would fit in better, but they have very little connection with anything else going on with the other two crises. There are a few spots where they might fit, but it depends on other things. So, they could fit before the end of the cycle. They very well could be the cause behind the first Psionic Empire looking into the Shroud, because they're goddamn terrifying. So, it's really how important you make the Zroni, who will be coming up in a second. They could happen between the end of the cycle and the contingency, which seems most likely, as there would be very little else that could weaken a force like the contingency so much that they wouldn't be able to fight back against the rest of the galaxy. Even like millions of years wouldn't wear them down enough, how strong they are. This would explain what the Pretherin are running from, that being, well, it could be, anyway, the contingency. Or 3, they could happen after the Crisis War in the first timeline, which is honestly just kind of thrown in because they're not defined as anywhere else. This is the author's placeholder zone, because the lore is over at that point, you could throw it in wherever. Now, this is about where the post ends, because they do talk about the Zroni. They say that the Zroni could potentially be the first Psionic Empire. One of the comments basically confirms it, because apparently the lore for the Zroni is that they were the first to use the Shroud. There you go. And they fought amongst themselves over how much they should use it. Because one side believed they should use it to their fullest extent and become gods, and the other wished to limit their use and tried to stop the other faction, because they realized the Shroud's energy came at a price and it was destroying the universe. They began to then fight, and it created the various aspects of the Shroud. And eventually the faction opposed to the Shroud's weaponization used up all of their material bodies fighting against the radicals, and it turned their bodies into Zro. They succeeded, but the Shroud was turned into the hell that it is now. And all of its entities and all of the monsters were born from the original conflict. Basically, they did what the Nemesis Crisis does, but they failed and the player succeeds. According to another user in the comments, this is very interesting, and it actually does seem important. This person says, there is a god in my head, says that they always thought the worm seemed kind of important. But, you know, that might just be them. But some people say it couldn't be that powerful, considering how easily you kill it. But the event text states that we don't kill it. It just leaves. It just fucks off, and it's still out there. And it's stupid to assume that it even fights us seriously or remotely tried, because it just kind of seems like a disappointed parent if we fight it. So, you know, it gives you a little slap on the wrist and then fucks off. And from the event descriptions, it seems that any sort of station or fleet would be just instantly obliterated, because it's a being of just, like, pure space-time and... I almost said warp fuckery. I've been watching too much 40k, man. Just, like, pure shroud fuckery. And if it really wanted you dead, like, it just... It can kill an entire system if you embrace it, and that's when it's happy. But it doesn't really represent the ability to break a cycle so much as create new ones, because it seems to exist entirely within closed loops, and it may be even actively preventing the end of any universal cycles. If you choose to fight it, you're still stuck in the loop, you're just taking a detour. And then I don't really understand this part, but I'll read it anyway because it seems important. In the Rendezvous event, the Admiral is clearly from an alternate timeline, or rather a past or future one, and he mentions being punished for fighting the worm, now brought to us most likely as a warning. It seems like he's been through a true hell, which makes the worm seem like a vengeful demon, but the worm isn't like us. It's an entirely different type of being. He might not understand how the effect it has on us, or how our minds work. He might not understand why we'd fight it, or how spooky and or overkill its punishments seem. It might just seem like tough love to the worm, correcting the path of its errant beloveds, the only right thing to do, really. But it's a bit of an Easter egg, and that feels like a bit of a stretch, but it was a very interesting comment, and I do think the worm is important, because it also talks about cycles, the moral of the original parent post being cycles. So, in conclusion to that little mini-essay, I do think the worm is important, but one worm-biased individual to another, yeah man, it's probably just us. Since the contingency is, to put it in Mass Effect terms, the Reapers, the Reaper Ancient rather than Prothean Ancient, this begs the question why the Robot Fallen Empire, which would be basically Prothean Ancient, has the Guardians of the Galaxy initiative and awakens when you get the contingency crisis. But this could probably be addressed as simply them being created to deal with a different threat, and misidentifying the contingency as that threat, or any threats, which the contingency is. Not important either way, just thought it was worth mentioning. Anyway, that will be the complete Stellaris timeline, according to one glorious and somewhat psychopathically obsessed Reddit post / individual. That individual being u/m3xg3n54. What a name. The post will be linked in the description, so do go check it out and, you know, upvote it, award it, whatever, because it's really good, and it only has 97 upvotes. So, yeah, this was enjoyable to make, I guess. I don't really have an outro prepared, but, yeah, you should subscribe, and I will see you later.